Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is get our project all set up, and we'll probably go ahead and prototype out a level in this video. Now, if you're going to be following along, you will need all the textures that I'm using. For the most part, they come right out of the Paper 2D template, so you could export them yourself. But I've tried to make this easier, and I might have added a couple of extra textures. So if you go to wiki.unrealengine.com/file paper2dtextures.zip, you should get access to this page, which will give you the files that I'm using. Now again, this is the exact same thing as the ones from the Paper 2D template. I've added one so that the character can jump. It's a really cheesy texture. I'll be making fun of it later. And I've added a little tiling texture that we can use for prototyping so that we can see the material do its sort of tiling thing in the background. Okay, so once you have that, make sure you extract those to a location where you can get to them, and we'll slide this off the screen. Now, I've already got these in a location on my hard drive. You can see them all here, and I'll be bringing that back in shortly. For now, let's build our project. Now, I'm going to build everything from scratch. We're not going to start from a template because that's kind of cheating when you're trying to learn something. So let's call this My Paper 2D Game, and we'll start with just a blank project with nothing in it. And let's click Create. Also, I'm not using any starter content. That doesn't mean you have to do the same thing. If you want the starter content for the materials and whatnot, that's fine. So we'll click Create, give that just a second, and it'll open up my new fancy game. Now once this opens up, we're going to need to import our textures in. Also, this level is great. It's fantastic, but it's a 3D level, so it's not going to help us very much. Let's go to File, New Level, and we will call this, let's go ahead and save it, like open it up and save it immediately. So we'll do a save, and let's call this My 2D Map. Of course, you can call it anything you want. I just want you to save it. Okay, so here inside the game folder, let's make a new folder, and we will call this Textures. And I'll open that up. Now, here are the textures that are included in that zip file, at least at this time. If I change the zip file later and you get a slightly different collection, it should still be good. Hopefully you'll just have extras. Now, I'm just going to drag and drop these into the content browser and let it do its thing. Some of them look a little funny because of alpha channels and whatnot, but that's fine. We don't care. They should still work just fine. Let's go ahead and go to File, Save All, so that those get saved, so that we will always have access to them, including if something, you know, explodes, because sometimes that happens. Now back in the game folder, let's make another new folder, which we will call Materials. And we'll open this up, and I'm going to make a new material by right-clicking and clicking Material that I will call Level Prototype. And that's exactly what this is going to be for. This is going to help us prototype out a level and give us something that we can see and look at and play with. So let's double-click and open this up. And thank you. Welcome to the material editor. Let's go ahead and close that for now. Now, a couple of quick changes. I am not going to be using lighting in this project. You can, though. Paper 2D totally supports lighting. So if you want to create a 2D game where you have lights in your scene, dynamic or otherwise, you can totally do that. I'm not gonna, so all of my materials are going to be unlit. So I'll select my main material node, and under shading model, we will set this to unlit. Now, what I want is a material that tiles and aligns to the world. So as I move the sprite around that has this material on it, the texture will appear to kind of slide around. The texture will be stapled to the world no matter where I put the sprite. So to do that, we're going to start with a world position. Actually, what we're looking for is an absolute world position, or that's what it's called. So we'll just click on world position here. And there it is. It says absolute world position on the node. I know it's a little confusing because it's a little differently named, but you're looking for world position anyway. Now, we're going to mask out the y-axis here. So let's do a component mask. So you just type mask and you'll see that. Now, this masks color, so you'll see everything is labeled as RGB, but RG and B are analogous to X, Y, and Z. So what I want is just R and B, and I don't want G, which correlates to the Y-axis. That's because this game is going to be flat. This game is not going to move in the Y-axis. It's only going to move in X and Z. So now that we have that, we're going to make a parameter. Let's, in fact, a quick way to make scale parameter, hold down the 1 key and click, and right-click on that and choose Convert to Parameter, and we will call this repeats per meter. Now we're going to actually divide that, excuse me. So hold down the D key and click, and we will divide that by 100 because 1 unit in Unreal is a centimeter. So that'll convert that over to a meter. Now we're just going to multiply these two values together. So this will cause whatever texture we plug this into to repeat once every meter in unit space within our game. Now, to make all of this work on a texture, we need to have a texture handy. So we're going to create a 2D parameter. So I'll just type in parameter. And let's see, we have texture sample parameter 2D. So that's what we want. And it's got a huge name on it. So we're going to change the name. And this is actually kind of an important step. If we want Paper 2D, if we want the sprite that we apply this to automatically have access to this texture, we need to give this a specific name. We're going to call it sprite texture over here in the parameter name. So that's important. Make sure you call it sprite texture. And there's no space there either. So we can take our result here and we can plug that into the UVs. And we could take the output and plug it straight into emissive color. Technically speaking, that will work just fine. However, we're going to do something a little bit fancy. Now, this is where I am branching out, getting a little bit away from what happens in the template. Because in the template, you just create this material. Well, this material is created for you. You don't have to create it. We're going to do something kind of fancy there. We're going to do vertex color. And we are going to multiply vertex color by the result of our sprite texture. Now you can also, if you want some opacity, and you don't have to have opacity, but if you want it, we can take our blend mode and we can set this over to translucent. And then we can take the alpha channel and we can multiply that. Actually, we probably don't even really need to do that because I don't think we're going to have an alpha channel in our texture. So let's just take the vertex color and we'll just plug that straight into opacity. Now what that means is we can change the sprite color later on, which you haven't seen yet. We'll assume you haven't seen that. But it just means that we'll be able to change the sprite color later for all of our template prototyping sprites. So with this done, there's a quick look at the network once again. I'll go ahead and kind of zoom in a little bit. You can see that. So that should be good. Let's go ahead and we could go ahead and apply our texture here. Probably be a good idea. So let's slide this out of the way with my slightly limited screen space. And under textures, you have the 2D background tile texture. This is the one that's actually included in the template. So if you just want to use that, that's fine. But it's a really boring texture. It's just flat gray, so you can't really see anything repeating. So I've added one called prototype texture. So we're going to use that. I'm going to select it, come over here to my sprite texture that we created a second ago. And if we scroll down, we can just hit the arrow and drop that in. OK, so let's save that. And we can now close out our prototyping material. Now, I want to show you a couple of things real quick. If you go under View Options, you can show the plugin content, and that'll suddenly make the Paper 2D folder appear. Now, inside of this, if you filter down by material, you can see the two materials that come along with Paper 2D by default. You have the default sprite material, which is what we'll be using for our character and basically for everything else. And I just want to point out the network for it. It's kind of important to be aware of. So notice it has a sprite texture parameter 2D, just like we created on our own. It's got a texture coordinate, which is really just there to supply basic UVs. And then we're multiplying the vertex color, which will be the sprite color, by the way, by the color output, and we're multiplying the vertex color alpha by the alpha output of that sprite texture. What that means is if you want to, if you're using this default sprite material, you can use your sprite color, which we'll be looking at later, to not only change the color of your sprite, but you can also make it opaque and transparent and play with its visibility a little bit like that. Now the reason I'm pointing all of this out to you, and no, I don't want to save changes, is that there's also a default lit sprite material. So if you want your sprites or some part of your game to be lit. You don't have to create a special material for it. You just have to know that this exists, and then you can point this at your sprites instead of the default one, which will be there automatically. So I'm going to leave this paper 2D folder visible for the time being. We might hide it again later if I get tired of looking at it. But really, I think with that, we've got our material portion taken care of. So let's take a look at creating a basic level. So here in my textures folder, I've got this 2D background. First off, let's go over to my game folder. Let's make a folder specifically for sprites. I think that's probably a good idea just for overall organization. So new folder, and we'll call this sprites. Now, I'm going to jump back over to my textures folder, and this is just the way I'm going to do this. You can do it in a few different ways. We're going to right-click on the texture and choose Create Sprite. And it comes in as 2D background sprite, which is really not a bad name. I'm just going to immediately drag that into my sprites folder and choose Move. So that moves that over. And there you go. We have a sprite that we can set up in the background. Now, here in my viewport, which we haven't really done anything in just yet, I'm going to go to the drop-down for choosing the type of camera, and we're not going to use perspective. You could, but we're not going to. We're going to set this to a front view. Now, front view allows us to see the Z and the X axes. Y is pointed right at us and it's orthographic, so it really doesn't matter at that point. We're going to drag this 2D background sprite into the level. And there you go. Now, all we see this is the wireframe, which is not super useful, so let's take the view mode and we'll set that over to lit. And we can see that background. Now, at this point, we could go ahead and prototype out a really, really simple level. So let's do something really basic we can alter later. We'll scale this up so that we can see. Now, be aware of this red line. That red line is going to be your kill Z. So you don't ever want the player to dip down beneath that because he will die. So we'll just set our sprite right on top of that. Now, let's create a new sprite that will be used primarily for prototyping out our level. So we can do that in a couple of different ways. What I'm going to do is come back over here to textures, and we could just create a one based off of our prototype texture, just like we did before. So let's just do that. We'll just right-click and choose Create Sprite, and we'll call this our prototyping sprite. And I'll drag that into my sprites folder and move it. Now we're going to make a couple of changes to this. So if I double-click it, this is the Paper 2D Sprite Editor. It'd be a good idea to flip through these different tutorial windows if you'd like to know a little bit more about this editor. For now, we're going to go ahead and close it because I'll be talking about a lot of that here in this video. Now, a couple of things. First off, we have the source texture that's already set up, which is all well and good, but I want to change the default material from the masked unlit sprite material instead over to my material, which is called level prototype. So we'll just switch that out. Actually, didn't I call it level prototype? Thought I called it something else. Let's double check what I called it because it wouldn't be the first time I've forgotten that sort of. No, it is called level prototype. That's fantastic. Okay, so we want to use that. A couple of other things though. So we have that parameter inside that material, and if you remember, it's repeats per meter, and currently it's set to 0, which is not super useful. So let's set that default value to 1, and we'll save that. So suddenly we can see the texture, and that's going to be really nice. Now, with that, that material applied to our sprite, we still have access to this source texture, but we can put anything into this texture slot that we want to. So if you have any other textures you'd like to test, for example, I could go under my view options and I could show the engine content folder, and here under engine we could filter down by texture. And let's just say I like, for whatever horrible reason, I like this bad texture. We could select that and we could drop that in. And then that is going to be used as our sprite texture, which that looks pretty horrible, and I don't really want to use that. Oh, here you go. Here's a random one we could just plug in. And there you go. So you can see how that specific texture is just being applied to our sprite. Now I'm going to put mine back over to our prototype texture. There you go. Now let's take a quick look at this sprite in general. So we can see it has a view, it has a source region. I'll talk more about this later and what it means because it's a little hard to explain when we're actually sampling the entire image. we can edit our collision, and we can edit the render geometry. We're going to leave all of this alone for the time being. This will be a lot more useful once we start setting up more shapely sprites, a sprite that is not just taking up an entire texture, especially when we get to characters. For now, let's go ahead and save, and we will close this. And for the prototyping, I'm just going to go over to sprites, and let's turn off our filter. I'll grab my prototyping sprite and drag that in. And you can see how that world alignment is affecting that sprite. It's just keeping that texture locked in place. Now I'm going to scale this sprite down and turn it into a platform. And then let's do a couple of things. First off, because I want the character, I want the player to be able to walk on this surface, I need to make sure that it is set to some coordinate in y that makes sense. I usually set everything to 0. I don't want to lock you into a rule that you've always got to build your 2D games at 0 in the y-axis, but since it's 2D, everything that needs to interact needs to be at the same coordinate in y, and 0 is really easy to remember. So if we want our character to walk on or interact with something or touch it or bump into it, we want to make sure that it's at 0 in y. Now that does mean I'm going to take the background, and instead of that being at 0, we're going to set that to -200 in y, and that'll push that back into the background. But we can't really see a difference because this is, of course, an orthographic view. Now, some other things. Let's go over to Basic, and I'm going to bring in a player start. And that's going to give us an idea of sort of how big our character is going to be. So obviously we have a tiny little level right now, which is good to know. Let's take our background, and I'm going to scale that up much, much bigger. And we'll move it up a little bit too. Again, we want to keep it up above that red kill Z line. We can take our prototyping sprite and just make that much bigger. And there you go. This is going to be super, super basic just to get things started, and we can build it into a much nicer level at a later time once we have a character all set up. But for the time being, this is enough to kind of get things rolling. We've got our first couple of sprites. We have a background, a prototyping sprite, and the purpose of the prototyping sprite is really so that as we get into creating our level, it's very easy for us to just bring in copies of this sprite. If we need a wall real quick, we can just make a wall like so. If we need a platform, we can scale it into a platform. It just gives us a lot of super fast flexibility, and that's what we'll be using it for. As a matter of fact, real quick, now notice I dragged this sprite in. What I want to do is I want to lay out this level really fast, but I want to mention, oh, thank you. I want to mention that when I drag this sprite in, you'll notice that it jumped to -190 in y. So for the time being, just visually verify that everything ends up at 0. So make sure that goes to 0, and then I'm going to just alt drag a copy to the other side of the view. We'll take this floor that we just created a few minutes ago, and I'll scale that up so it can overlap. That should be just fine. Okay, so I've framed out a really simple box level, and that's good enough for us to get started. So that is going to wrap things up for this video. Now, in the next video, we're going to build some more involved sprites, and we'll take a look at a few more of the details and uses for the sprite editor.